Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the Innovation in Linguistics talk series presented by the journal Cognitive Semantics. I am honored to host today's lecture, which represents the 15th in the series, but the ever first one given in the place. And before the talk, I'd like to make a brief introduction to our journal. Cognitive Semantics is a peer-reviewed international journal focusing on the relationship between meaning and mind. We welcome submissions of unpublished research from all theoretical perspectives within linguistics. The founding editor and editor-in-chief is Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee from Beihang University. The journal's consulting editors include Professor George Lakoff, Ronald Acker, and Leonard Tomey. Our review editor is Professor Ed Fuyin. Our associate editors are Professor Dylan Green, Martin Gilbert, and Francisco Jose Ruiz Mendoza. And we're supported by a dedicated team of editorial assistants, including Dr. Liu Na from Central China Normal University, Ze Ronggao, Yuhang Yang, and me myself, Zidan Li from Beihang University. The information and recordings of the previous 14 lectures are shown here. They can be found on our WeChat platform and YouTube channel. And today, we're honored to have Professor Hendrik De Smet as our guest speaker. Professor Hendrik De Smet is a professor of linguistics and PhD supervisor at the University of Leuven in Belgium. His expertise is in the history of English, historical linguistics, cognitive linguistics, and COSE linguistics. Through his publications, he has contributed to the understanding of the mechanisms that drive language change. He is or has been a member of various editorial boards of leading journals in the field, including Functions of Language, Diachronica, Journal of English Language and Linguistics, Journal of English Linguistics and Linguistics, and has been associate editor of Cognitive Semantics. Currently, he serves as a program director of the Linguistics and Literature programs at the University of Leuven. The topic of his lecture today is the isomorphic principle. Can a good idea survive difficult facts? And now let's welcome Professor Hendrik De Smet.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for hosting me here in this series on innovation in linguistics. That's a special honor. It's also great to be here in Beijing, and it's also wonderful to see again some of the people I met back in Leuven. And even though the distance between Leuven and Beijing is great, today and the past couple of days prove that the distance is sometimes not so great. So we can also get close again, and that's just wonderful to know that these ties continue and persist. So thank you, and I hope you will find this talk interesting and worthwhile. I got a little worried listening to the introduction, because I suddenly realized that this series is on innovation. And actually, I'm going to talk about an old idea. So maybe it's more like renovation in this case. But this is in good Belgian spirit. Belgians can't resist renovating. All Belgians want to renovate their houses and build extensions to them. And I think that's what I will be doing here today. The isomorphic principle. Can a good idea survive difficult facts? Here's a short outline. I will give an introduction to isomorphism briefly. And then I'll talk at greater length about some of the problems. So the idea used to be popular in cognitive functional linguistics. My impression is not anymore. A lot of question marks have been raised. But I think this skepticism around isomorphism is perhaps a little dangerous. We might be throwing out the child with the bathwater. So I will propose a number of solutions, where I think we can try to, ways in which I think we can try to rethink the isomorphic principle. And that's the core of this talk. But so first, the isomorphic principle itself. The isomorphic principle is a principle of linguistic organization that says, in the words of Beihang, 1980, I think that's maybe the standard definition. Isomorphism is a bi-unique correspondence that tends to be established between signals and signatum, between the form and the meaning side of the linguistic symbol. Now, this is a very central and very old idea in linguistics because actually it goes back certainly as far as European structuralism, early European structuralism with Saussure, who maintained that all signs hold each other together and defined one another's semantic scope. And isomorphism recaptures that idea. To explain isomorphism, I've given a kind of simple example here where you see both the form side in phonetic notation here and the semantic side of the linguistic sign shown pictographically. The perfect isomorphic situation is the one you see in A, so that's in green. So this is ideal isomorphism. We have two meanings and two distinct forms. B is a little problematic because we have a single form, boom. This incidentally is the Dutch word, but doesn't matter. We have a single form, but two different meanings. So that's not a bi-unique correspondence. It's not one-to-one. It's one form to two meanings. And then we have C, where we have two forms with the same meaning. In this case, Bohm and Bloom. It's a purely hypothetical example. Both designating or both denoting a tree. So again, that's not a bi-unique correspondence. That's two forms, one meaning. Yeah, and this is in red because this is problematic. This is a no-go according to the isomorphic principle. Now, the isomorphic principle has been interpreted in a number of ways, or can be interpreted in a number of ways. Actually, the most common interpretation is a no synonymy rule. It's a rule that says there shouldn't be two forms that express the same meaning in language. And that's the situation that we have in C. So that's probably, by most proponents of the isomorphic principle, that's probably regarded as the worst possible violation. But we can also say, well, there should be no homonymy or no polysemy, and that's the situation that we see in B. I put a question mark next to no polysemy because I think very few linguists today would argue that language strives to get rid of polysemy, or that polysemy is somehow problematic in language, because everybody recognizes that polysemy is all over the place. But I'll come back to that. I think, in fact, a strong case could be made that even polysemy is somewhat problematic in language, or yeah, that there is more isomorphism in polysemy than we actually think. Okay, so that's the situation that we see in B. Now, in this lecture, when I talk about isomorphism, I'm talking about all these variant interpretations at the same time. So I will take the strongest possible definition of isomorphism, so that includes no synonymy, no homonymy, no polysyny. Okay. Now, I myself come to this topic as a historical linguist, and the reason is that isomorphism is often invoked, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, as a principle of language change. So when we read accounts of language change for any particular language, you very often come across explanations of the type, well, this particular expression changed meaning because it was in competition with another expression, or this expression was lost because it was in competition with another expression. So there is always the idea that somehow isomorphism will assert itself, and that's the explanation for why language change happens. Language change on that view is kind of therapeutic. It restores the system to its perfect, ideal state. I think this is nicely captured by a quote from Simon Dick from 1988, where he makes a comparison to happiness. No one is perfectly happy, but we strive towards happiness. In the same way, a language is not perfectly isomorphic, but it's always striving towards isomorphism. It's always trying to restore the state of isomorphism, and that's what Dick says drives language change. So here is a very simple example. Middle English, that's the English spoken somewhere between the year somewhere between 1100 and 1500. Middle English had two words for the concept dog, Hund and Doge. Now, as we can see here, these words seem to be quite interchangeable, and they both seem to be basic level terms, and you can tell from the fact that they are used in metaphorical, semi-fixed expressions. For instance, you will die as a dog, or like a hound, he should die. Or it is not good a sleeping hound to wake, versus it was perilous to wake an old dog from sleep. So we see these two words these two forms being used in very similar contexts, presumably with the same meaning. This is anti-isomorphic. This is a violation of the no synonymy principle. And lo and behold, what happens? By present-day English, hound has specialized. It's become a special type of dog, a dog that will be used in hunting. And dog has retained the status as basic level term. You can use dog in pretty much any context today, but hound will be restricted to contexts of hunting or and the typical hound will be something like a beagle or a bloodhound. Okay. Yeah, so isomorphism seems to be working quite well here to explain this change. Yeah, still, you can ask a couple of questions. Why did Middle English allow this anti-isomorphic situation to arise in the first place? How did speakers of English decide? How did they choose that dog should become or retain the status as basic level term and hound should specialize? Why not the other way around? Or why not lose hound or lose dog? So we can already feel a certain tension here that isomorphism, it has a certain intuitive appeal, but it's not telling us the whole story. Okay, and that brings me to a lot of the problems, and the recent literature has questioned the isomorphic principle to an important extent. First of all, it has been observed time and again that variation is common in language. And I like this particular example from French because it's kind of funny, I think. So these are all ways in which French speakers can ask pretty much the same question, when are you coming? So speakers of French can say quand venez-vous? But they could also say quand est-ce que vous venez? Or they could say vous venez quand? That's my secondary school French. But if you consult a corpus, it gets a lot more exotic because you can also start getting things like quand vous venez, quand que vous venez, quand que c'est que vous venez, quand c'est que vous venez, quand c'est que vous venez, quand que c'est que vous venez. Okay, it goes on. I'm not sure all of these variants are equally frequent. I would be surprised, but it is striking. It is striking that there are so many different options available to speakers of French to do roughly the same thing. Okay, here's an example from English, from my own research. I think many second language learners of English are bothered by this, prepositions, and what is the correct preposition in the correct environment. As it turns out, there's quite a lot of variation. So example here, 1, 2, 3, with emotion adjectives, in this case, excited, emotion adjective excited. You can be excited about something, you can be excited at something, you can be excited by something. I might argue that excited in the third example is perhaps a bit more of a verb than an adjective. I grant you that, but still it's variation. I've tried to map this out, and you can see in the plot 6 different prepositions that combine with emotion adjectives. In this case, it's just emotion adjectives here. And then the various emotion adjectives they combine with, and the lines show the possible combinations. And what's interesting here is the color coding. So the prepositions are in gray, but the adjectives are in the yellow to red range. And yellow is for adjectives that have high loyalty. And high loyalty means that they are loyal to a single preposition. For example, proud or afraid, they just take off. Can only be proud of something or afraid of something. But for instance, nervous is in orange. So I'm not sure if you can see the pointer. Yeah. So here's nervous. You can be nervous of something, you can also be nervous about something. The opposite of loyalty is, I think, promiscuity. So the most promiscuous adjective here is disappointed. Disappointed can combine with in, by, at, with, over, about. The only preposition it did not combine with in the corpus data was of. Okay. Now I know if you present this to a functionally cognitive oriented audience, the first question that will be raised is, yes, but did you consider that there might be small differences between these prepositions? Maybe speakers of English use them in slightly different contexts. If you present this to a variationist social linguistic audience, that's perfectly normal, but the cognitive functionalists will immediately question this. And I think they're right. I'm sure there are semantic differences here, but let's have a look at disappointed. So disappointed came out as the extreme case. So it combines with, by, at, in, about, over. This is disappointed over time, and the prepositions it combines with. And we can see that, so here in 1800, disappointed strongly favors in. So in is the main preposition that occurs with disappointed. This is followed by a stage around, let's say, the second half of the 19th century, where at is the dominant preposition. Then it's with, and today it's by. So in 200 years' time, the dominant preposition with disappointed has switched well, 3 times. So we had 4 different dominant prepositions. If there's really such an important division of labor between these prepositions, that's not what you expect to see. There's too much switch over here to explain. I think this is hard to explain in terms of in purely functional terms, or in purely from the idea that these prepositions must be usefully expressing different meanings. Sure, they have slightly different meanings, I don't question that, but is this so useful? I'm less convinced there. Okay. Throughout these 200 years of history, the loyalty score for disappointed remains roughly stable. So that's the white dotted line here. So that means this very anti-isomorphic state persists. It continues to exist for at least 200 years. Okay, so I don't know what the right time frame is for isomorphism to be restored, but 200 years seems like a pretty long time. So that's yeah, that's maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations, depending on how you measure generations. So speakers of English don't seem to be too bothered with all this variation. Okay, we can go a step further. We can could actually argue, and this argument has been proposed by, among others, my colleague, Hendrik van der Velde, in a paper from 2014, that where isomorphism maintains that the optimal functional organization is one-to-one, one form to one meaning, because it's economic, it's not error-prone. It minimizes the numbers of forms a speaker has to remember. It minimizes ambiguity. So that's the isomorphic ideal. It could also be argued that actually many-to-many is ideal. It has functional advantages. And we see this, for example, in physiology. Think of something like sweating. Sweating has several functions. It helps in thermoregulation, so it controls the temperature of the body. If you get too hot, you start sweating, it cools you down. It also has a secretion function, so it secretes whatever is unwanted from the body. So that's one form, sweating, 2 multiple functions, secretion, thermoregulation. The other way around, if we look at thermoregulation, that function is also expressed by different forms again. So again, one-to-many. Thermoregulation is realized by sweating, but for example, it's also realized by the veins under the skin extending and rising to the surface again to reduce body temperature. And in several other ways, so the hairs on your skin can raise or not, and so on. So we really have many-to-many relations in physiology between functions and the way they are realized. We also see this in animal behavior, and that explains the picture here. So chimpanzees, for instance, have been observed, and this is described in the paper by Kuhle, 2014, that's cited here. Chimpanzees have been observed to use the same instruments for different tasks and approach the same tasks with different instruments. So, for instance, a straw can be used to pull ants from an ant heap or to poke an ear or something. So, again, we see many-to-many relations. We also see this in social organization. Think, for instance, of childcare. There's many ways in which you can organize childcare, and societies will invest in all these ways at once. So for instance, children can be taken care of by a stay-at-home parent, by a grandparent, in a daycare, by a nanny. Yeah, and all these systems coexist in society at the same time. At the same time, grandparents' function is not only taking care of children. Grandparents do a lot of different things. For example, they may organize a book club, or so they can do all sorts of things. Again, many-to-many mappings. Even in programming, we see that there is many-to-many mapping. The famous slogan of Perl programmers is, "There's more than one way to do it." So why is this? Well, because it's functional. You need multiple systems in place for the overall organization to be robust. You need grandparents in place because at one day the daycare will be closed. You need to be able to regulate your body temperature in several ways, because, for instance, when you're swimming, you can't sweat, or when it's humid, sweating is useless. So actually, you need several ways to solve the same problems. And you could argue, well, language should violate isomorphism, because if you stick to these one-to-one mappings, you're kind of stuck with one solution for the same problem all the time. The same communicative task would have to be performed by the same formal means. And that might be suboptimal. That makes your system less robust. And I think this is a very convincing argument. Okay. I've already talked about language change, and isomorphism could sort of explain language changes, but not all the way. So it leaves questions unanswered. I've already mentioned this, so I can skip over this more quickly. Then there's some of my own work. Together with a number of colleagues, we wrote a paper where we described the phenomenon of attraction. And attraction is the situation where functionally similar expressions develop towards functional identity. And again, you don't expect this from the perspective of isomorphism. From the perspective of isomorphism, you'd expect that if expressions are functionally similar, then either one of them will disappear or they will functionally grow apart. There's still many questions to be answered about attraction. I don't know exactly when attraction happens. I don't know exactly why it happens, but I think I know it does happen. And the very fact that it happens is a challenge to the isomorphic principle. Here's another interesting paper again. A colleague of mine is involved. The lead author is Gardner. This is a paper that looked at disfluencies in language, with the idea that disfluencies could be a sign of ongoing cognitive struggles. If there's a kind of cognitive overload, that's the point where you would get disfluencies. So disfluencies are things like, so in example one, it seems like the weather pattern is just shifting and that the jet stream is, and so on. So these disfluencies are very common in spoken language. I think the paper says something like they make up about 6% of what we are saying, so that's a lot. But they studied the disfluencies precisely to investigate whether choice contexts might be a source of cognitive struggle, whether there is some kind of heightened cognitive overload whenever you come to a point where you have to choose between two variants. And what they find is that, in fact, that's not the case. There's no statistically significant evidence to support the idea that, at least in this research setup, to support the idea that variation impacts cognitive load. In fact, you could, and this harks back to the idea of many-to-many mappings being functional. In fact, you could argue that variation actually reduces cognitive load because you have many options to choose from. So you maybe it's easier to optimally adapt to whatever functional needs you have at the moment. I think that's a very convincing case that's being made. Yeah, so what's left of isomorphism after all of this? Maybe we should just check it out. And that's what I would call the easy way out. That's the easy option. Poplex 2018 makes a passionate argument for just get rid of the old thing, throw it out. It's had its time. It's had its day is over. She speaks of the doctrine of form function symmetry and accuses proponents of isomorphism of holding on to a naive idea about language, an idea that's also cherished by prescriptivists, but that is just in conflict with the very empirical facts of language. She argues variability is inherent, it's natural, it's normal. So away with isomorphism. Here's another answer. That's what I would maybe call the diplomatic answer. Isomorphism needs some fine-tuning. And I think the paper that I think in a short time has gathered a lot of attention is by the paper by Leclerc and Morin from 2023, where they propose that instead of a no synonymy rule, so they specifically target the no synonymy principle, we should envisage a principle of no equivalence. And this principle of no equivalence, well, there are two reasons why they adopt this reformulation. The first is that synonymy is too often interpreted in truth conditional terms. So they say, okay, meaning is more than just truth conditional meaning. But also that two forms can be pragmatically or semantically near equivalent as long as they are socially distinct. So social distinctness comes into the picture. In a way, I think what they cast as a diplomatic answer is actually pretty much the position taken by Poplex, but maybe couched in kinder terms. Because what they are saying is, well, you know, variation is normal, it will have a social function. So isomorphism is not actually all that strong. Now, I think these authors are making an important point, and they're telling us that we really need to rethink isomorphism. But at the same time, it is important to be aware that there is also evidence in favor of isomorphism. Evidence coming from language acquisition, animal and human animal communication, evidence coming from language change. So, for example, there's a paper that I've always admired and loved by two Flemish colleagues, De Vogelaar and Evi COSE, published in 2011 on second-person pronouns, and they observed that Middle Dutch had the pronominal system that you see on the left here, with distinct singular and plural forms in the second person, so du and gij, or he in Middle Dutch. But he extended to the singular. For pragmatic reasons, it was used as a politeness marker and gradually replaced the du. So this is a process that's also been observed in other languages. And what happens, we get a kind of homonymy because singular plural is no longer distinguished. We have the same form to express two different meanings. as a result, a lot of dialects of Dutch began to innovate new plural forms, and they did so more or less independently because you get a lot of different variants for this. But the one that made it into the standard language eventually is derived from this Lieden. And then so isomorphism is restored, and then this gets less or no attention in the paper, but these Lieden also in a variety of dialects extended across the plural paradigm, so that you also see it showing up in the first and third person, because again that re-establishes isomorphism in a way, because now plural is more consistently marked across the paradigm. Yeah, so we do see isomorphism at work here, at least so it seems. Here's another example, and actually this is the one that changed my mind about isomorphism, and somehow it's funny because it's very peripheral to human language, but in an article by Pilley and Reed from 2011, we get a description of a couple of experiments involving a very, very clever border collie called Chaser. And Chaser learned the words, learned words for, I think, about 1,000 different objects. So Chaser could uniquely identify 1,000 different objects. Chaser also knew 3 verbs, so you could tell Chaser something like put your paw on object X or sniff object Y. So this is truly amazing, I think. But the thing that grabbed my attention is that if Chaser was presented with a new word, Chaser would go and look for a new object. So Chaser was essentially adopting a no synonymy principle. Chaser assumed if there's a new word, it must be referring to a new object. There can't be synonymy, it can't be an object I already know. So this I think is wonderful, because this is perfect evidence for a no synonymy principle that is somehow at work. Now, okay, you can say this is dog-human communication. That's maybe a bit exotic, but similar things have been observed for human children during language acquisition. Children are known to struggle with synonyms, so they try to, when confronted with synonyms, it's been observed that they try to twist the synonyms in such a way that they come to cover that the forms come to cover different meanings. So, for instance, Dutch has 2 words for cats, poes and kat, and I still remember that one of our children at one point asked me, so kat, is that for bad cats? So they were also struggling with this synonymy and trying to assign different meanings to the 2 forms. Okay. And this for me is reason to think that, okay, maybe we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss isomorphism. We shouldn't throw it away just yet, and rethink this. And what I'll suggest is that isomorphism is a functional principle in language. It is at work in linguistic organization, but it interacts with other things. It interacts with variation and with the social factors that drive variation. Totally agree on that. But it also interacts with other functional principles in linguistic organization. And maybe we don't always see isomorphism because we're not always looking in the right place. And that's the point that I will be making here. And I'll highlight 3 different principles: the organization of semantic structure, redundancy, and analogy. Let's start with semantic structure. Strictly speaking, polysemy is a violation of isomorphism. Now, most linguists, as I already said, have accepted the fact that polysemy is all over the place. Just open a dictionary and you'll see. And it's been argued that this is for good reason, because, as Lakoff 1987 wrote, polysemy serves the function of greatly reducing the arbitrariness of correspondences between form and meaning. Why? Well, because meanings that somehow belong together can be grouped together under a single form. So polysemy makes sense. What's more, different senses of the same form are motivated extensions from a single core sense. So this polysemy is not randomly organized. It's actually subject to strict organizational principles. Different senses are derived from a single core sense, and this single core sense has a kind of privileged sanctioning status. How are these extensions motivated? Well, through the major types of conceptual association that work in human cognition. That's association through similarity, think of metaphor, and association through contiguity, think of metonymy. The result of that, senses that belong together are lexicalized together, and in a way that's a very economical way of organizing your lexicon. There's an example here for cold. Core meaning of cold is the one that you see here. Exciting the bodily sensation of losing heat to the environment. Derived from that, we get, for instance, meanings like unfriendly, that's a metaphorical extension, or the meaning experiencing cold, as in the example, you're going to be all day, I'm cold. Speaker here doesn't mean that if you were to touch them, they would excite the bodily sensation of losing heat to the environment. They're actually saying that they are experiencing this, this sensation of losing heat to the environment. So that's a metonymic extension. Now, because motivation runs from core to periphery, it could be expected that the further these extensions go, the more tenuous the hold becomes that a core has over its semantic space, over the semantic territory it occupies. And we could expect that at the periphery, that's where competition with other forms could become fiercer. And I like to draw an analogy here that I would like to call the kitchen drawer principle. So in our home, our top kitchen drawer contains a number of items, knives, forks, spoons. I would say that's the stable, predictable core function of our top kitchen drawer. In fact, speaking from experience, in most homes, that's where I would expect to find the forks, the knives, and the spoons in the top kitchen drawer. If we go vacationing in a holiday home, that's also the first place where we would look. So this is kind of socially coded or socially entrenched in a way, conventionalized. And then there's some space left in this top kitchen drawer. And the question is, what are you going to put there? Well, for instance, in our home, we have some chopsticks there. That's not a core item in a European kitchen, but it's there. And this makes sense. It's a kind of metaphorical extension from forks and spoons and knives, I think, because it has the similarity relation, same function. And then we get other items that I would say are maybe more peripheral extensions, things like scissors, like knives, they cut. Things like wooden spoons, okay, that's also a kind of spoon, but it's bigger. Can openers, maybe that's roughly the same size as these wooden spoons, a bread knife, and so on. Yeah, you can see the extensions, the motivated extensions there. This is quite opportunistic. It's because there is this extra space, but at the same time, it's not completely unmotivated. Now, where do you expect competition? Well, maybe over these peripheral functions. Where you find the wooden spoons, that's not quite as predictable as where you find the regular spoons, or where you find the garlic press, and so on. Yeah, the picture here, that's an aside, but I didn't immediately find a picture of a kitchen drawer to my liking, and I asked an AI image generator with the prompt you can see there. So a word of comfort here: AI is not quite there to to take over our jobs. So humans are still needed to evaluate what the AI output. So as you can see, I got something quite weird here. It's almost well, it has a certain aesthetic, I admit that, but it was not what I was expecting. So it's almost a surrealistic painting. Okay, yeah, a lot to think about there. But that's just an aside. The important thing is, where do we expect competition? Well, for these peripheral extensions. And this is an idea that, together with my former PhD student, Tsai Ying, we tested. And we tested it on prepositional semantics. And here is the preposition at. Okay, we know from the cognitive literature you can draw these vast radial networks to describe prepositional semantics. So we had to do something a little simpler to make it feasible. We divided the semantics or the various senses of the preposition at into a core. We assume that that would be the space sense. It's the most frequent sense in corpus data. It's also where you usually find the core. It's also supported by other studies on the same preposition. So for instance, the two crates stood at the foot of the steps. So at is a kind of precise kind of denotes a precise location in space. It's kind of point locator. Then we get a number of primary extensions. For instance, the obvious space-to-time metaphors, as in, at night, the Duke locked the door of her room. But we also get direction with action and direction with gaze. You can throw stones at a painting, or you can stare at the road. And then we get the more peripheral extensions, and there are the emotion adjectives again. Maybe see where this came from. For instance, you can be upset at something, and here at has a very abstract function. It's almost marking an argument relation. So upset is an emotion predicate. Emotion predicates project a cognizer or a sentient being that undergoes the emotion, that feels the emotion, and something that triggers the emotion, so kind of cause. So what we have here is at almost marking something close to an argument relation. So it's an abstract grammatical function. Not so easy to link this back to the spatial meaning of at anymore. So I think this is quite peripheral. And when we look at networks in the literature, so yeah, let's see if I can momentarily move the. Yeah, so you can see this. So in blue, we have the core senses. In green, we have the primary extensions. And in at, we have the peripheral extension. And importantly, this is not our network, but it's one by Brenner 2015. So independently, so this paper independently arrives at the same idea that this object of emotion sense is the most peripheral sense. Okay, now, how did we test whether, let me go back, whether the core and primary extensions are less vulnerable to competition than these very peripheral extensions? Well, we kind of thought of a sort of roundabout way to do that by looking at parallel translations of the same text. I will talk more about parallel translations in today's time. So if you're interested, there's more that you can hear about these. It's a very, I think, a very promising type of corpus. So here we have parallel translations of Don Quixote, the classic of Spanish literature, with 4 recent English translations from 1949 to 2003. And the Spanish is not so important here, but what we have is, well, in our corpus of parallel translations, we selected, we queried the corpus for occurrences of at, and selected a sample of occurrences of at, and these are the target instances. And then we looked at the parallels that occurred. So we asked, what do other translators do to express the same meaning? And you can see here that they can do different things. They can go for the same preposition. So we have at the ease and at the ease in 2003 again. Or they can go for an alternative preposition. The 1999 translator went for about the ease. Okay. Sometimes they do something completely different and do not use a preposition at all. So that's what we call no syntactic equivalence. For the visualization to come, that was not taken into account. So the visualization to come just focuses on the situation where we have a target instance with either an identical choice or an alternative choice. The identical choice tells us there is no competition, or indicates that there is no competition over the same semantic space. The alternative choice suggests there is competition, there is variation. If we look at the numbers, this is what we get. And indeed, we find that the most variation, the most instances where at is found to vary with other prepositions across the translations, is in the object of emotion sense, the most peripheral sense. We find much less variation in the primary extensions, direction of action, direction of gaze, position in time. And this is the only, so far our expectations are confirmed. The one surprising thing here is the position in space. So we see some more variation there than we expected, because this is the core sense. But we think in retrospect that there's good reason for that. These spatial meanings are highly salient, and that's the crucial function of prepositions, and that's where prepositions make many very subtle distinctions in meaning. And we think that that is what we're seeing. There are actually, okay, yes, you have variation, but very often the variation is triggered by just a slightly different lexical choice that then triggers a different preposition. But by and large, we see that, yes, most of the variation occurs in the more peripheral meanings. So, yeah, we could make a case here that isomorphism is not everywhere, but it does show up in places, and there's a pattern to this. Isomorphism is stronger in semantic cores, it's weaker in semantic peripheries. On to the second principle. Can I ask, how am I doing for time?
It's quite flexible.
Oh, it's quite flexible. Okay. That's dangerous to say. Okay. So 20 minutes?
10 minutes is fine.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So on to redundancy. Redundancy is a violation of isomorphism. Why? Well, because, again, it's many-to-many mapping. So there's an example of redundancy here in the example, here on the left. So in English, these three black cats actually marks plural 3 times. Marks it in the demonstrative, these as opposed to this. It marks it by using a numeral. If there's 3, there's obviously more than 1, so it's sort of kind of plural marker. And it marks it inflectionally with cats. Interestingly, Mandarin marks plural just once by using the numeral, but it's redundant elsewhere. The meaning of cat is kind of captured also by the classifier. So the classifier, contains some of the meaning of the lexical noun. Now we could say, okay, this is useless because you're expressing the same meaning several times. But it's been found that redundancy is actually very common in language. Shannon, 1949, the father of information theory, famously argued that English prose is about 50% redundant. You could leave out 50% of a prose text and pretty much preserve the meaning it expresses. Exactly how he calculated that eludes me a little bit, but I think I think it's intuitively correct if you look at the example here. Now, Shannon also argued, and I think this is the brilliant insight that he brought to information theory, that this redundancy is actually very useful. You need redundancy. The communicative signal needs to be redundant because there will always be a little bit of information lost through noise. A good communicative signal is redundant. Think of traffic lights. Traffic lights are very important. If you miss a traffic light, it could, it's a life or death mistake. So the meaning that traffic lights express is coded redundantly by color, by shape, and by position. And this is, on top of that, this is also universal. So all over the world, traffic lights are coded in exactly the same way. So this is a redundancy that that is highly, highly, highly functional. The more you think about this, the more you see that this redundancy is everywhere, but it's also useful. It makes sure that the message comes across. Okay. So it's anti-isomorphic, or so it seems, but it's functional. But I'm going to argue that there is actually a kind of hidden isomorphism in this. Redundancy is pervasive in language, as I just argued. And we could actually say that redundant contexts can be regarded as an extension of the formal side of the sign. So you could say that a redundant context gives a sign with a particular meaning a unique formal signature. For instance, cold is polysemous, but these various senses occur in unique contexts. This is the idea of that underlies distributional semantics. You shall know a word by the company it keeps. We know that cold means, has its core sense, giving the sensation of losing heat to the environment, that one, when it combines with coffee, for example. We know that it has its metaphorically extended sense when it combines with smile. And you could say that in a way here, the form is not, there's not a single form here. There are multiple forms because there is this unique contextual signature. Coffee is part of the form of cold, just as smile is part of the form of cold. And if we think of polysemy in this way, then it's not a violation of isomorphism at all. Because every sense of cold is supported by a unique formal signature. Cold plus coffee means literal cold. Cold plus smile means metaphorical cold. Okay, now what I'll try to argue here is that, in effect, this contextual redundancy is what supports polysemy. So this unique formal signature is what supports polysemy. And without it, a sense would revert to pure isomorphism. Here's an example. It's a kind of, it started out as a toy example, but since then it's been tested much more thoroughly by one of my PhD students, Hilke Kuipens, in a paper that's now submitted. This toy example, but now proper example, looks at the meanings of bright and dumb. Now, both bright and dumb started out historically as describing some kind of external meaning and then developed an internal meaning alongside. For bright, the external meaning is emitting, reflecting light, as bright as 100,000 suns. And the internal meaning that developed is intelligent. He was a bright pupil. For dumb, the external meaning was unable to speak, and it extended to the internal meaning lacking in intelligence. So when Charles was struck dumb, he lost the ability to speak. If you say it was a dumb plan, you mean that the plan was indexical of poor intelligence or lack of intelligence. But this has very different consequences for these two adjectives. Here you can see the frequencies, and you can more or less ignore the gray and green shades and focus on the blue and orange. The blue is the core senses, or the original external senses for bright and dumb. The orange is the internal extensions. Now we can see around 1900, both these extensions towards a new internal meaning were quite new for these adjectives. But what happened in the case of bright, nothing much. In the case of dumb, the new sense completely took over, to the point where it's very likely that the external sense for dumb, lacking the ability to speak, unable to speak, is about to disappear, or maybe already has. Okay, now why is this? Well, precisely because of the element of redundancy, the principle of redundancy. Here, for bright, the two senses are well supported by contextual redundancy. So each sense has a unique formal signature. In the case of dumb, that's not the case. And the reason for that is that bright is a metaphorical extension mapping from one domain to another, whereas dumb has undergone a metonymic extension that's driven by contextual inferences. And we can see this in their collocational behavior. On their internal use, bright and dumb typically associate with humans and animals, or manifestations of sentience, like words, ideas, smiles. On their external use, this is also true for dumb, but not for bright. So dumb, on both its external and internal use, combines with the humans, animals, and so on. For bright, we get these two very separate experiential domains, and very distinct contextual signatures. There's another example here that we developed, but I'll skip over this much more quickly, but we see the same principle at work. These are a number of forms that express the meaning narrow. To start with English narrow, then it's Dutch cognate naar, So that's the, yeah, that goes back to the same Germanic root as narrow. And then we have the Dutch item eng, which is related, interestingly, to English anxious. So that's, again, related, historically related form. Now, all of these started out with designating or denoting a spatial meaning lacking in breadth. So that's clear for narrow. For nad, this is obsolete. For eng, it's still attested, at least in written Dutch. They underwent metaphorical extension, all of them. For instance, English, to withdraw into a narrow family circle. But then, naar and eng in Dutch also underwent metonymic extension, again, inferentially driven. And that's fatal to the same meaning because this extension occurs in the same contexts as the source sense. And so we see that in English, where the metonymic extension did not occur, the metaphorical extension and spatial source sense survive. In Dutch, we see that where the metonymic extension occurs, we see that the source and metonymic senses get lost. Okay, so polysemy then can be thought of as deep down isomorphic because a unique formal signature, formal sign plus redundant context connects to a unique sense. There's actually a one-to-one mapping. But we have to be willing to think of the form of the sign as spread out over the whole context. Finally, analogy. Synonymy is a violation of isomorphism, but sometimes the emergence of near synonyms can be motivated on other grounds. And an example here is the development of have to alongside must in English. We've got near synonyms here. Both must do and have to can express deontic necessity, as in you must go in there alone, or why did life have to rush on so? And they can express epistemic necessity. Bobby must have drifted into sleep, or that had to be the funniest movie I ever saw. And again, they're not perfect synonyms. Must tilts towards epistemic necessity, have to tilts towards deontic necessity. The deontic necessity that must and have to express are also slightly different. Must is a bit more based in the speaker, so expresses more speaker authority. Have to leans towards external necessity. But yeah, these items are certainly in competition. I think there is no real question about that. Why is this? Well, there are good functional reasons. There's a problem with must. Must is a defective verb. It doesn't have a past tense, it doesn't have an infinitive, it doesn't have a present participle, it doesn't have a past participle. So there's a lot of things that must can't properly do. Had to, have to, can do all of that, and you can see it in the examples here. So somehow, yes, of course, English had to innovate a marker of deontic necessity to use in past tense contexts, to use with modals, to use in non-finite clauses. This is how English innovated have to. It started with ambiguous contexts, and these are contexts where we get these alternative syntactic parsings, as in the example, this gentleman is one whom I can entirely trust, therefore what you have to communicate to me, he may hear. Now, what here can be the direct object of have, but it can also be the direct object of communicate. And depending on how you parse this, have is a more or less lexical transitive verb with its own object, or it's part of the modal have to, and the lexical or the transitive verb carrying the object is the lexical verb communicate. So this is probably the context where have to was reinterpreted as a modal. It becomes an unambiguous modal when it occurs with intransitive verbs, as in I have to talk to you of matters of consequence. Why is it an ambiguous modal here? Well, because have to can't be a transitive verb because there is no direct object. Now, if you look at the history, we see that these ambiguous contexts are far more dominant in the early stages. So here they make up about 80% of all occurrences. And then they gradually become less prominent as the frequency of the unambiguous uses dramatically increases. And they also dwindle to kind of near non-existence in present-day English. Now, when we look at the ambiguous context, we see that most of them, surprisingly, are simple present contexts. So the majority of ambiguous have to in the 1710s to 1780s, that's this earliest point in time here, are simple present contexts. But the unambiguous contexts at the same time, they are typically non-present tense, so past tense, non-finite forms like present participles, past participles, and infinitives. That makes obvious sense because those are the contexts where must can't be used. So that's the context exactly where you need this new modal. And then we see that only with time, the present tense contexts also begin to accept this new modal. So these are the unambiguous uses of have to over time, and we see that gradually the present tense takes over. Now, what is the story here? Yes, isomorphism failed because competition arose, but competition arose for a good reason. There was a gap in the system. And we can also see that even though isomorphism failed, it certainly delayed the filling, or it certainly delayed the emergence of have to in the context where there was competition. So we see that have to is much slower to emerge where there is competition than where there is no competition. So it arrives first in the context where it's not in a competitive environment. Only then gradually it manages to extend beyond that. So this is the point I just made. So concluding remarks. Isomorphism, we can argue, shapes usage and language structure only. It's not the only force at work. It's there in a mix of a variety of functional principles that shape the architecture of the linguistic system, and it interacts with those principles. It interacts with the prototypical organization of conceptual categories, it interacts with redundancy in the speech signal, it interacts with the analogical forces that shape grammatical structure. And as a result of that, we find isomorphism, but we don't find it everywhere. We find it at work in categories COSE. We find maybe less evidence at categories peripheries. Isomorphism is not so strong that it prohibits polysemy, but when polysemy is not supported by contextual redundancy, isomorphism surfaces. We get a drive towards monosemy. And it interacts with the analogical forces that shape grammatical structure. Sure, it can be overruled by analogical leveling, but it will delay the process. So, yes, of course, language is variable, but that does not mean that it cannot also be isomorphic. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Professor Hendrik De Smet. Would you like to have a rest for a second and allow me some time for a quick summary? Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor, for your insightful talk, and merci de vos idées brillantes. And now I'd like to make a brief summary of the lecture. Inconsistence with title, Professor Hendrik De Smet revisits the good idea of isomorphism, which advocates the one-to-one correspondence between form and meaning. Well, despite strong intuitive appeal and a long tradition within linguistic research, it is, however, faced with a lot of challenges, which is referred to as difficult facts in the title of the topic. That is, the difficult facts, such as the empirical evidence in favor of an anti-isomorphic account, and the solutions of two extreme answers, like to refute, to dismiss the idea of isomorphism, or to stick to it, or to model, to conjure the isomorphic principle. And we take studies on words like apt, bright, dumb, narrow, and also model expression have to, and must. It is suggested that isomorphic principle is interacts with the semantic structure, redundancy, and analogy. And isomorphism, of course, has its role to play within language change, but it is not the sole force in play. And also, language is variable. It is potential to great change, but it does not preclude language from being isomorphic. And now we're opening up to questions. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to propose the questions and directly discuss them with Professor Hendrik De Smet. Okay.
Excuse me, I'd like to take the first opportunity to propose a question. You have mentioned that redundancy can be regarded as an offsetting a strategy or kind of mechanism that contributes to the sustenance of the polysemous usages. However, how can we explain the very original innovative collocational extension in the very first place, which is obviously a kind of counterexample to the isomorphic principle? Yeah.
Yeah. I think the important point is that there are several factors or several forces at work. On the one hand, we want to use the same word in a variety of possible usage contexts, and there is something to say for that. Human experience is infinitely variable, so we cannot possibly have an infinite repertoire of ways to capture that experience. So somehow we have to economize on that. We have to use the same forms to capture our experience. I mean, even down at the most basic level, every time you see a person, it is not exactly the same person anymore. Maybe their hair has changed, or they're wearing different clothes, or they're so our experience of reality is in constant flux. So of course, language has to be able to accommodate that. In the most trivial way, but also in creative ways, because we encounter new things. We encounter new plants, new animals, new technologies, and so on. It's part of human experience that you're always coming across new things that you somehow have to try to categorize within your existing conceptual framework. And that's what semantic extension does. We need semantic extension in order for language to function. So a language without the possibility of semantic extension would be an unusable language. It would be like a programming language. So you couldn't use a programming language in real life. At the same time, isomorphism comes in the sense that it allows for this to happen. It actually supports this because polyphony can be supported to the extent that you will have a unique formal signature for every sense in your polyphony network. And if that is not the case, then the polyphony will again break down. So I think the two are working together there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
May I? As you said, isomorphism interact with many other principles. Do you consider it like a strong force or weak force? For example, when two principal conflicts, is how language solve this problem, like who compromise or?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question.
Yeah, I know it's complicated.
So that's the. Maybe I should repeat it. So the question is, isomorphism is one among many principles. When they get into conflict, which one wins out? How strong is it? And in fairness, I don't know. And I think that's the challenge because. And maybe also the weakness of the argument that I've just made, by invoking multiple principles in a way you're always right. You will always find your answer. If isomorphism fails, then I say, I know, of course it was analogy. And if analogy fails, I say, well, yes, of course, because of isomorphism. So I can be always right and that wouldn't be honest scientifically. That wouldn't be scientifically honest. So I think it's a very important question to ask. How exactly do these principles interact? How much polyphony can be sustained? How distinct do formal signatures have to be in order to sustain polyphony, or how indistinct do they have to become before polyphony collapses? How strong does the analogical pressure be to overrule isomorphism, and how strong is isomorphism in relation to analogy? These are really important questions, and if this model where the architecture of human language is shaped by multiple interacting forces is to be scientifically validated, then that's the question to answer. At the same time, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I can sort of think of the rough outline of a model, but exactly how those forces, when and where those forces kick into action, that's a very, very difficult one. Now, what's the way forward here? Because this you may think, okay, this is a disappointing answer. What's the way forward here? I think, at least from my discipline, which I would regard as historical linguistics, it's large-scale studies. It's looking at many expressions, trying to measure to what extent is there, for example, to what extent is polyphony supported here by contextual redundancy? And in those cases where it isn't, do we actually see that senses are being lost? And then you can start measuring these things. And this is also one of the things that the project I mentioned with my PhD student Hilke Keukens is looking into. So we're really trying to scale this up in order to be able to tackle that kind of question. But yes, it's a very important question, and one I think that historical linguists don't ask often enough. We're very often satisfied if we have a principle, so we can explain something, but yeah, of course you need to. work out how all these different principles work together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor De Smet. Thank you for your insightful lecture. So my interest is locative alternation, just like a sibling of dative alternation, like John loaded the hay into the van, or John loaded the van with the hay. So they are called motion construction, and the formal one is more frequently used. So can we regard the formal one as the more prototypical one in polysemy, or what's your viewpoint?
Yeah, now you're extending prototypicality to variation. So that's an unusual, maybe an unusual step to take. Can you repeat?
The example?
Yeah.
Like John loaded the hay into the van, or John loaded the van with the hay. Load into or load with. The first one is the latent as the object. The direct object is the like the something, and the second one, the subject, the object is the location.
Yeah. Okay.
So could we regard the first one, the more frequently used one, as the prototypical one?
Yeah. So the simple answer I would say is probably yes, in the sense that the prototype is what you expect, or maybe what a speaker expects. Of course, I'm not sure if extending prototype in this way is yeah, well, I think it is appropriate, but it requires quite a lot of rethinking. I'm sorry, I'm hesitating here. If you approach this from the idea of say the many-to-many mappings, then of course you can argue that the existence of both these structures is reasonable in language, or is motivated in language. There will be environments where the less frequent pattern is actually the expected one. So I keep forgetting which one is more frequent now, but they differ in word order, right? And so, yeah, depending on what you want to present as new information, or what you want to cast as given information, you may choose one or the other. So I think prototypicality is going to the extent that it's a reflex of expectation, and to the extent that contexts also form a kind of categories that can be prototypically organized. Prototypicality will be contextual. So one may be the expected form in one context, the other in another context. And the fact that both exist is perfectly natural. I think this ties in with the argument of the many-to-many mappings, or the argument from the paper by Gardner et al. Who are saying, well, yeah, this variation is not a problem because actually it's a solution to a problem. It gives you more flexibility. Yeah, okay. Sorry, that's a very roundabout answer to your question. Yeah, but I hope that's an okay answer for you.
Okay,
Yeah.
And perhaps we can now turn to these questions
yes.
proposed by online audience.
Yeah. See a few familiar names again, so that's so nice. So regarding the first question, so could it be that excited at derives from being excited at the thought of? Yeah, that's a plausible way in which at may have entered this particular context. I don't see it as problematic. So yes, at somehow extended to emotion adjectives, and this is a plausible pathway, but the fact is that it's used there now. So I still think that excited shows variation between a variety of prepositions. Some of the time, all prepositions are possible. Some of the time, some of them are possible. And maybe some of the time, only one of them is possible. But I don't doubt that there is variation. So I hope that answers the first question there by Xing'an. And then there's Xiangwu. So I have to read this. Oh. Yeah. So if isomorphic pressure is strong enough to reorganize form-function mapping so as to reduce functional overlap, then why is it unable to prevent functional overlap from developing in the first place? I want to know if your answer to the question has changed over the past few years. Yes. Well, first of all, it's a rhetorical question. So the presupposed answer was that isomorphism failed, and of course I still think it does, because you get synonymy, you get synonymy. So in that sense, my answer has not changed. Isomorphism is not so strong that it prevents any synonymy from arising. My answer has changed in the sense that I would no longer ask this purely as a rhetorical question to which I think the answer is obvious. So yeah, my mind has changed about isomorphism very much after the publication of the 2018 paper, where I think we have been a little bit too harsh in our judgment, and it's precisely the fact that my attention was drawn to evidence supporting isomorphism that made me change my mind a little. Because if we think of this evidence of homonymy avoidance, evidence from language acquisition in children, evidence from human-animal communication, if we think of this evidence, I honestly cannot think of another explanation than an explanation in terms of something like an isomorphic principle. Maybe other evidence that has also persuaded me. So the 2018 paper deals with attraction, but there are cases in language change where attraction just does not happen. So, for instance, think of the situation that was briefly mentioned in the presentation. It's the situation where you have two second-person pronouns. One for, in the traditional terminology, a T pronoun and a V pronoun. The T pronoun is for addressing people you are familiar with, that you are intimate with, that you are close to, or that you are socially superior to. The V pronoun is for addressing people that you want to defer to, so you show deference. So you express negative politeness, or you express social distance. Okay, so languages like French, German, Dutch, Mandarin also has the contrast between ni and ning. So they preserve, they have these two items, and in a way they are always in competition because the boundaries between am I going to address as someone I'm close to? Who am I going to address as someone I'm only distantly related to? When am I going to assume social superiority, or when am I going to express deference, or when am I going to choose not to express any superiority or deference? So the boundaries of these decisions, they are constantly shifting, and the literature shows this. So for example, in European culture, it used to be common for children to address their parents with the V pronoun, so they would use the formal differential address. Today, it's common for children to use the T pronoun, so they will use the intimate address pronoun. So the boundary has shifted, but there is absolutely no attraction. These two remain opposites. So the T pronoun and the V pronoun, as long as they coexist, they express a different function. So they do not attract. So there is a complete failure of attraction there. And I think this holds for any closed system. And the more closed the system, the more stronger this force is. Think, for example, of languages that have case. Of course, the nominative is going to mark the subject relation, and the accusative is going to express non-subject relations, and this is not going to they are going to keep a distinct function. They don't attract to each other. Think of singular and plural in English. They are related in a way, but and the boundary of where you use singular or plural can shift a little. But again, these two are not going to attract, so there is a force keeping those apart. So I think it's important that I think the statement holds that isomorphism is not so strong that it prevents functional overlap from developing. But the implication that isomorphism doesn't exist, I would no longer accept. I think it's there because there is simply too much evidence to support it. Yeah, so that was a long answer. I'll move on to the third here. That's a very interesting question. So, so you can also see it, right? So it's the relation between nouns and verbs in Chinese. So of course I'm at great risk of saying something very stupid here because my knowledge of Chinese is not it's very far from perfect. But of course. This is exactly where contextual redundancy comes into play. So the same lexical item can be a noun or can be a verb. And just to be on safe ground, I will translate this to the English situation. So for instance, I can hold someone's hand, or I can hand someone a book. And in the one case, hand is a noun, and in the other, hand is a verb. What supports this, you can think of it as a special kind of polysemy, and it's been referred to as heterosomy, and maybe it's also what the person asking the question here has in mind. It's a special kind of polysemy, but it's very strongly contextually supported. So you immediately know from the context whether hand is a noun or whether it's a verb. And the reason you do is because there's all these syntactic features in this case that tell you so. The verb has a particular position. The verb can take an object. The noun can take pre-modification by an adjective phrase, or for instance, in Chinese, can take a classifier and so on. This is the perfect evidence of redundancy supporting this huge flexibility that languages may have in using the same items in what seem to be very different functions. As to the claim here, is there a category of big nouns? So I don't know this particular study, and would have to know the arguments. But my first gut reaction is that maybe it's not necessary to try and reduce to one or the other, because this type of flexibility is actually what is typical of language to begin with, although it will manifest in different languages in different ways. At the same time, I'm intrigued by the suggestion, and would be curious to see the argumentation. So I hope that answers the question.
So if there is no more question, let's call this the end of the talk. And thank you again for your insightful talk and for sharing about your ideas on the classical topic of isomorphism. And perhaps we can now take a group photo in this meeting room.
Okay. All these and the pillows.
Yes,
Yep.
and thank you for your participation, especially the online audience. And now I'll cancel this meeting.